So the honeymoon period is over now. Today we are getting into the crux of the work here, right? We're actually going to get our hands dirty and start doing some journalism on a very small scale. So let me walk through what we'll be doing this week, and then there'll be a separate video going through your assignments. You see here in the week 2 outline, we're going to be going over chapter 2, which is really just dissecting news stories, what the components of them, what makes up a news story. You were going to learn most of those lessons from the actual reading. In just a minute, I'm going to just hit on some highlights, but this is really what you are focusing on your own time here, is going through chapter 2 and learning the lessons of the components that make up a basic news story. You're going to take a quiz and complete the exercise, both in the homework folder. Like I said, there'll be a video in here that goes over what your assignments are. This is not graded, completely optional, just thought you might enjoy it. Read about your classmates on the discussion board and leave some comments. So your classmates talked about last week, your assignment was to just give you a biography about yourself, really an autobiography, but to give a little bio on yourself. And, like always, interesting people in this class, diverse backgrounds, diverse places of your life, which always just makes for, a really interesting and compelling group moving forward. So I want you guys to all, I'm encouraging you all, go back. It's a small class. We only have like 4 or 5 students. So you could go through, read all about your classmates, see who else is going through this with you, learn a little bit about them. And if you feel inclined, go ahead and leave them a comment too, right? Maybe get a little bit of a dialogue. Not graded. I'm not doing the, leave at least 2 comments for grades. I just want you to do this if you want to do it. This one, again, it's not graded, but this is only going to help you out in this class and really in life, and that's read news every day. I think I said this in last week's video, but make an effort to sit down and read a couple stories a day. And I'm not saying you have to go get a print newspaper. It could be on your phone, right? But don't just read headlines. Don't just read a headline and a couple paragraphs. Go find from credible news sites. You could start with, I think everyone here is in Connecticut, at least right now, the Hartford Courant, or if you have a local newspaper, the Middletown Press, if you're living in Middletown, read a story or 2 from there, and try to read stories that you typically wouldn't read, right? So if you're always drawn to sports or an entertainment piece or human interest stories, like a profile on somebody, read the hard news, read a political story. Just start to diversify your news diet and start to read different styles and start to read different topics and how they're covered. Just reading 1 or 2 stories a day is going to go a long way, because what's going to happen is you are going to start making connections from this class, especially after this week. You're going to start learning how news stories are constructed, what they're made up of. And then as you read stories on your own, done by professionals who are working in the industry, you'll start to make those connections from what you're doing in class, from what you're seeing, and then what you actually write. And it just becomes this, flow where it's going to be like you're learning each aspect, is going to help you with the other one. So by you creating journalism, it's going to help you understand, when you read it, understand how those stories are made up of, which then is going to you're going to learn from and make you a better writer, right? So it's kind of like an ecosystem here. So read news every day is only going to be to your benefit. Okay, I'm going to just quickly go over chapter 2, just so you understand, what I want you to get out of the chapter. So, news stories. When we say news, and you know this probably a little bit from your reading last week, or maybe you've just been able to pick up on this in your own life, but there are a lot of different types of news stories. It all fits under a big umbrella. Some are like human interest stories, like a profile. So, talking about, I'll use sports as an example because this is a great one. You talk about an athlete and his or her challenges and journey to get to being able to play to this big game, the Super Bowl, right? So the challenges that led up to this player, and now they're in the Super Bowl, and they had this throughout their life that created the person they are and led them to that point. That's one form of journalism, that the story on someone, a human interest story. Another form of journalism in that same realm is covering the game. So here was the score. Here's who scored at what time. Here were pivot points in the game, right? That's a news style too. So both are considered news pieces. Both are considered under the umbrella of news, but they're very different, right? just as it's very different for an explanatory journalism where someone is taking an issue and you're looking at all the nuance and exploring how this issue came to be, climate change or something, right? As opposed to here was a vote on a bill and here's how many voted for it, here's how many voted against it, and here's why they did. It's different. It's different, but they're all fitting under news. So when we're learning about breaking up a news story or learning about what makes up a news story, yes, there are several different styles, and we're going to learn a few of those throughout the semester. But still, for the basic news story, there's some key components. So when we're thinking of basic news story, as your chapter will go over, it's basically when you're reading the front day's paper, if you have a print paper or whatever, the top article on a site, right? That's the basic news story. It's just kind of like, here's an overall explanation of something that's happening right now. And that's what we're really starting to explore this week, because there is I don't want to say there's a formula, right? It's not like there's just only one way to write that type of a news story, but there is kind of like a guideline. There is a system that we follow, a recipe that you follow, and your news story and your chapter will go into that. But I will give you one example. What page is it on? If you want to even pause this or just go to page 34, you go to 34, you'll see it's the inverted pyramid. You're going to hear that a lot. In fact, what I'm going to do, let's see if I can get clever here. There we go. Right? So you see that's an inverted pyramid. It's pretty much an upside down pyramid. You'll probably hear this. You've probably heard this before, and you will hear this a lot in this class. But that's your basic news story. That's the structure. And you start off with your lead. So your lead is like it's the first sentence that's hooking, bringing you in, kind of giving you an explanation of what you're about to read. Then you have the nut graph, which is a paragraph or two explaining the whole story. So even if you only read the lead and the nut graph, you have a pretty good idea of like what that story was at least about, or some of the key pieces of information, right? You usually kind of by then know the who, what, when, where, and why to a degree. You know the basics. Then you have your lead quote, which is a quote you're going to learn about terminology in chapter 2. So quotes are word for word what somebody said. Usually adds a little bit of flavor, a bit of spice to the story. So you're going to get some perspectives with a quote. Then you have what's called like background information. So that's context, more context to the story. And then you're closing off at the very bottom with like a last key fact or something. And that's a basic structure that we all fall under. Now, what facts you choose, what quotes you use, how you decide to get that information across can all vary using that structure. The way I write it will be different from the way maybe another journalist writes it, from a way that you write it. But still, if you broke it all down, you see that formula being used, right? You kind of see that recipe in play. And so that's what this chapter is doing. It's introducing you to terminology, right? Basic terminology, like what's attribution, what is a quote, what is a lead and a nut graph. I'm trying to think of some of the other ones. Interview, but an interview, how are you getting the information? What's the focus? Every story has a focus, a main point, right? Because a lot of these stories, it's complicated. It's not just as simple as saying this happened. There was a lot of different factors, and there's a lot of different points, a lot of pieces of information, touch points in that story. And your job as the journalist is to say, well, how do I boil this down to one point, one main focus, one sentence to get this across to somebody, right? So, you're going to learn about what a focus is of the story and how do journalists decide what a focus is when they're writing a piece. So that's what this chapter is about, terminology and understanding the components that make up these basic news stories. This is really a foundational chapter that's going to because now we're going to start to get more specific week to week on how you write in a news story. How is a feature story different from the basic news story using these same tenets, using these same fundamentals that you've learned from this week. I don't want to get too far downfield in this video, but that's what this week is really about. Okay, so I've given you a brief explanation of the basic news story. After reading the chapter, you should have a much better sense of what that means. After you get through all that, then take a look at, in the homework folder, the next video, which is me going over the assignments. You do have some assignments due, as you know from here, right? Quiz and exercise. And then I will see you next week.